Hey guys, Josh from College Football Nerds here, talking Week 1 football. We're going to be discussing Georgia versus Clemson, doing a preview of the game. Give us a little bit of patience this week. As a lot of you know, Daniel unfortunately has been in the hospital since this weekend, which means I don't also have access to all the production tools we're usually used to. But we did a live show on Monday night where we did a preview, so I cut that up, put it up here for people to watch. Please comment, like, subscribe, share. And we're going to get back to our regularly scheduled programming as soon as we can. But in the meantime, here's our preview of Georgia versus Clemson. I think for a lot of people, this is really billed as the big game coming into, coming into 2024. Georgia's obviously the 800-pound gorilla of college football right now. They've earned that, I will say, completely on their own merits, right? Georgia has dominated college football for the most part for the last 3 or 4 years, with the exception of the few times that Alabama managed to beat them. And when they've done so, they've continued to show just week in and week out that they have one of the most talented rosters. They are one of the most consistent defensive teams in the sport. And they have managed to do that despite continually losing impact players at multiple levels. Now, I think the interesting story for a lot of people that question Georgia is you look at that roster, you look at what they've done, and I know a lot of the analysts I've talked to, the curiosity is, how are they going to replace Brock Bowers? How are they going to replace Ladd McConkey? Guys that were, by and large, the key cogs that made the machine turn at Georgia. And, I think the short answer to that is no one really completely knows until the football gets played. But we did see previews of that in recent years, because Georgia as a football team, let's start on the offensive side of the football for them. Most everyone you're going to see are guys that have played a good bit. Carson Beck, Trevor Etienne, Dominic Lovett, Ra Thomas, who's not there now, so it'll be Dylan Bell, probably more Oscar Delp. Guys like Arian Smith have been the depth for them. A very experienced, very talented offensive line, maybe the best offensive line in college football, though you could say that for about 4 SEC teams. Something I didn't even really talk about with Texas A&M or anyone else is just how much these offensive lines are good within the conference, and how much good in this conference may well be average because of how good a few of these lines are. You'll hear about that as well with LSU. But I think the interesting thing there is really twofold. First, when you talk about who Georgia is in recent years, we've repeatedly pointed out that I think their offense gets a bit of a bad rap because of the tempo at which they play. So let's look at, first off, just pure statistics, okay? And this is something we did in the offseason. I looked and I tried to generate NFL-style statistics for the SEC. And what do I mean by that? And I'll put this in the chat as we're talking so people can actually pull this up for themselves. That's about the best I can do live. What happens when you take sack yardage and you subtract it away from the passing and rushing productions of the quarterbacks? And what you find is, if you look at the 2023 numbers for quarterbacks in the SEC, where sacks are attributed to passing yardage, they're attributed to the quarterback. LSU and Jaden Daniels, unsurprisingly, was first in the conference at 10.03 yards per attempt in an NFL-style passing statistic, which is a bonkers number. Bonkers. But second is Georgia and Carson Beck at 8.82. And the thing I want to emphasize about why they were so good and why it felt like he was so good, even though his numbers weren't necessarily that high in a lot of estimations, it's the lack of sacks. So if you look at just conference leaders in passing yards per attempt last year, Jalen Milroe was second at 10 yards per attempt. Carson Beck's third at 9.5. Jackson Dart is fourth at 9.4. Brady Cook at Missouri was 9.0. So Beck is sitting in there at third, kind of squeezed right in the middle of 3 players. But when you start factoring in sacks, all of a sudden Georgia, they're at 8.82 and Missouri's at 8.0. They're way better than Missouri or everyone else in the conference. Alabama is at 7.1. They go from second in the conference all the way down to 6th. And so the thing that made Georgia really so remarkable was the fact that they didn't take sacks, that they were able to efficiently and effectively move the ball. They had great yards per attempt, but they had the yards per attempt without anywhere near the number of negative plays that the other major quarterbacks and major teams in the conference had. And I will say the other thing that came out of that, and again, you can find the link right now in the chat, which should be scrolling by live, was what happens when you started looking at rushing statistics when you take sack adjusted yards out. So I already made the point, right, that if you looked at passing leaders in the conference, that you saw where Beck was. But let's think about Trevor Etienne as a running back. He was sixth in the SEC in yards per carry. And if you looked at just rushing offense generally for Florida, they were all the way down there at 10th in the conference at 4.3 yards per carry. But again, I think that was really hidden by the fact that they took so many sacks at Florida. If you take the sacks out and you just look at Florida as a run team purely on runs, Florida moves up to 6, 5.2 yards per carry. Auburn was 5th at 5.5. Georgia was only 4th, actually, at 5.7. Kentucky, Tennessee, and LSU were actually your best running teams. And what I think that goes to show is really Georgia last year was much more dependent on Carson Beck than I think many people realized. As a run team, they were good. They were not elite. As a passing team, they were darn near elite. And a lot of that did go through Brock Bowers. But the running backs, I think the running backs were all really good, but they weren't necessarily, the Nick Chubb, Gurley, Marshall type backs that they were used to. This year, I think ETN, and looking at those statistics I just noted, Florida was actually a much better run team than people realized, and ETN was a big part of that. So you put him on that Georgia team, and now you have an impact runner to pair with that offensive line, to pair with Carson Beck. I think you end up with a really, really darn good offense. And again, I talked about BCF toys a minute ago. You look at the offensive efficiency ratings, and the best way to look at it is points per drive. Okay, so you look at 2023 points per drive. Who's sitting there third in the country? It's Georgia, 2.4 points per drive. Number 2 was Michigan at 2.5. Oregon was first at 2.7. You look down, number 4 goes from 2.4 at Georgia to 1.8 with Liberty in net points per drive. But in just terms of pure offensive numbers, third Georgia, first Oregon, second was LSU, and the gap points per drive between LSU and Georgia was 4.01 to 3.93. Yes, LSU scored a lot more points because they ran a lot more plays, partly because their defense allowed teams to score so fast. They go back on the field. They had to keep trying to score. Georgia sat on leads. They burned clock. The team runs the ball more. They let a much, much lower number of plays get run. But on a given drive, they scored, it was within 1/10 of a point per drive as LSU. They were just as effective at scoring. And it's going to be interesting to see how much the loss of McConkey and Bowers impact that. But I think it's notable. And, having now had that long, long discussion of Georgia, let me turn to talk about Clemson defensively in their front a little bit. Clemson's defensive talent, I think, is good, but not where it's been. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that turns out. We've talked at length about, in our view, the 2015 through 2018 era at Clemson was really about one generational set of defensive linemen. When you break it down, yes, they had elite quarterback play, and that was necessary. Yes, they had elite wide receiver play, and it was necessary. But the glue that got them there, the thing that made them consistent, the thing that quite often shut down opposing ACC teams and made it so difficult for them to lose, even when Trevor Lawrence was prone to have some real off games. One was the fact that at the running back position, they had, a familiar name in ETN that could score points whenever it was necessary. But the other side of it was that defensive line just dominated games. And somebody told me to drink water, and that's a good reminder. It's very hard to talk for an hour and a half straight. The fact was those guys, Watkins and Wilkins, that whole crowd, Bryant, Simmons, so many of them started 3, 4, even 5 years. And from that entire period, to have that many dominant defensive linemen that start that long, that stay that long, made them consistently great. Most of the time, those players would have left by their junior year, and they were getting 4th or even 5th years out of a lot of those guys. This past year was, in my view, kind of the final transition of that football team. When you look at Clemson and who they were as a football team, I don't know how many years, when you looked at sacks for the Clemson Tigers, Xavier Thomas's name showed up, and he's gone now. I don't know how many years you looked at Jeremiah Trotter's name come up, or Rook's name, and I'm not going to try his last name because I know I'll get it wrong. Those guys had been around forever. Nate Wiggins had started for years. Tyler Davis had started for years. This is a new crop of Clemson players. And I think sometimes we make a huge mistake of thinking that a team like Clemson's had great fronts for years, and we assume that you'll have that perpetuity. But, when you have a team like, Missouri, who's had many years of great defensive lines, Missouri, for years, they said Pinkel was going to be able to reload on their fronts. And when they first joined the SEC, they were great. And then they had a couple years where they were down. And I think Clemson may be somewhere in the same boat. The recruiting has been very good, stellar by ACC standards, but it's not been elite by SEC standards. And what I mean by that is they're not consistently signing multiple five-star defensive linemen every class. They don't have a ton of Murphys and Sweats floating around. Last year, they took a little bit of a step back, but they still had a big core of those defensive players that were there. And I think this year, without those guys, relying more on developmental guys because they don't take the portal, it's going to be interesting to see how they hold up. So I think, in my view, Georgia has a pretty significant advantage when they have the ball offensively, because of where I think Clemson is. I think that's why the spread is where it is. And then the other side of the ball, right? Clemson's offense. Long and short of it is the offense has been merely okay the last couple of years. Klubnik has proven not to be the same pedigree of quarterback as the last couple. Yes, he's probably better than DJU, but we just saw that being better than DJU doesn't mean a lot. And I will say, even when he came in and replaced DJU, I didn't think he was that much better. I think Maffa has the potential to maybe even be a better running back than Shipley. I know maybe that's controversial, maybe it's not. A lot of the people I talked to in that area have had the same opinion for a while. But the hype with Clemson right now are those big time, 5-star level wide receivers that are probably going to play or start as freshmen. I'll make the same point I made the last time Georgia played Clemson. I said, George Pickens was not a part of our preview, and he was a freshman, as I recall, and we took a lot of heat for not talking about him more. And as I recall, he had 1 or 2 receptions in the game for like less than 15 yards. And our point is, when you're in a season opener, it is almost never that you see freshmen have a major role, and it is virtually never that they have a significant impact in the game. It does happen, but it is exceptionally rare. And I will say with these two players as well, they are, while they are really good or great receivers, there are a couple guys this year, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams at Alabama, Cam Coleman at Auburn, that are massive impact players that are probably going to have a big role on the teams. I'm not sure if either one of these guys is quite at that level. I mean, they were top 5, top 10 overall recruits. And what I see from these Clemson receivers are receivers that are probably going to be great receivers for Clemson and impact players in week 8, in week 9, in week 10. I think it's probably asking a little bit too much for them to try to be the stars of the show immediately. And again, they have to be the stars of the show against a Georgia team that is just loaded. I mean, defensively, they weren't the world's best against the run. They were very good last year, but they were definitely a step back from where they have been. But a lot of those guys, Williams, Stackhouse, Chambliss, they're back. Smile London's back. I do have questions about Georgia's back 7. I think it's going to be interesting to me to see how well they really do hold up in this game, because they did lose a lot. I thought some of those reserve linebackers and corners when they played last year didn't always look great to me. And I went back and did try to look at some film for that. And so I think there's some question marks for me with Georgia and where they're at on the defensive side of the football. But I also think that's not who Clemson is right now. And what we're going to have to see, in my opinion, for Clemson to win this ball game is Clemson's going to have to be able to throw the ball at a level that they have been unable to do in the recent past. Klubnik is going to have to operate sometimes under pressure. Now, we talked about this a lot when we did the Alabama preview, right? Georgia's scheme brings pressure. It's now a mostly zone-based scheme, still some pattern match, man coverage stuff. But it's also a 2-gap scheme. 2-gap schemes, meaning when you're a defensive lineman, your first responsibility is usually to hold the player up and monitor gaps to your left and right. You're not shooting gaps. You're not actively penetrating. You're not actively trying to get back into the backfield. That does mean that you don't generate as much pressure. And if anything, the last few years, and again, I'm going to pull this up on the fly because I already know what I'm going to find. Georgia has consistently not ranked very high in sacks. 2023 sacks per game. Where's Georgia? 11th in the conference. 2022, where were they? 7th in the conference, even with a great defense. 2021, they were 2nd in the conference, and that's when their defense was absolutely stinking spectacular. Because if they can be that high, they are absolutely spectacular. They're not going to be that high. And so Clemson is going to have the opportunity to throw the ball some. And if I had more confidence, frankly, in the Clemson's passing game, and I think if this was week 7 version of Clemson, I would have more, and it is Clemson, I'm trying to say it right, more confidence in where they were. I think we would see them be more successful. But in week 1, I just don't think it's there. Again, the spread right now is 13.5. The over-under is 48.5. I will tell you I'm a little more bullish on Georgia in this game. I actually have it 34-13. Now, I think this is a game that is going to be a competitive game for about 2.5 quarters. I just think it's a situation where Georgia is going, and again, number 3 in the country last year in offensive points per drive. They slowly, quietly, deceptively build a lead. And I think once they get up, and they're probably going to get up with something like 20, go from like 17-6 to 24-6 in the third quarter. It's going to change Clemson's game plan, probably generate a negative play. All of a sudden, Georgia's going to get some quote unquote cheap points, and it's going to be like 34-6, turning into 34-13 in the final minute. I just don't think Clemson's in a place right now to play Georgia. It's nothing against Clemson. Georgia's just in a unique place in college football right now. They are the number 1 team on everybody's list for a reason. And we've been on record on this, and so I'll say it again. College football is determined by injuries. Injury luck is a part of the sport. Depth is a part of the sport. Everyone in every system has had to win a championship by being healthy and getting through the season. That's nothing new. Georgia last year, they got knocked out by an Alabama team, and I really think that was bad luck in its own way, in a different way. I think Georgia, they had injuries to the wide receiver and the tight end position, and I think if they had a fully healthy McConkey and Bowers, I do think they beat Alabama. And look, I think it's fair to say that, as it's fair to say that Alabama probably would have beaten Georgia in the national championship. It's a fair observation. I saw those Alabama starting receivers beat Georgia that year only a month prior. It is not crazy to say Alabama probably would have beaten them if they were fully healthy the next time. But that is football. It's not an excuse. It doesn't take away from the championship. That is part of the game. In the same way, Georgia having injuries last year is part of the game. But I do think that Georgia team, had they not had those injuries, would have beaten Alabama. And had they beaten Alabama, I would have found them to be the considerable favorite to have won the national title in the playoff. And most of that team returns. I think this is a special Georgia team. And until some of those, it is an open question for me where the back 7 is going to be. Actually, really similar in my mind, a lot of ways to Alabama, that I think is just as unproven, if not more so. And whichever team can shores itself up more, they're going to be, I think, the clear front runner in the SEC, in my mind.